in your trading, how you take risk, how you manage risk, how you execute, how you hold yourself through that is one cohesive whole.
I could teach you my technical analysis and my strategy.
Okay, the more you understand what is going on down there, the more you can start to change things, the more you can start to adapt, the more you can start to evolve.
Where you're continuing to make progress and really understand yourself.
Kind of fell in love with trading again. I'd fallen out of love with it by then.
Welcome to another episode of the Trading Battles weekly interview series, where we sit down with traders from around the world to explore their strategies, the lessons they've learned, and the real stories behind their journeys in the markets. Today, we're honoured to host a true celebrity in the trading world, Steve Goldstein. Steve's journey in the financial market spans nearly 4 decades. So let's hear all about it. Steve, welcome. Nice to meet you.
Oh, hi, Jason. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, it is lovely to meet you, actually, because I do follow you in LinkedIn. So I do read your posts and I do know a little bit about you. But I know that you started, I started nearly 40 years ago and you did too. So that's quite interesting. But your path was different to mine. I was a market maker on the life floor, the futures exchange, and you did the corporate route.
Yes, yeah. Although I probably would have been trading with you at various points without realising it on the futures exchange.
I don't know about yourself. You know, you're pretty much the master now at performance coaching and trading psychology, and we'll talk about the book a little bit later. I really only understood the importance of trade psychology probably after the floor. I was a market maker, and you're not sort of dealing with the same psychological issues as maybe retail traders are today. When was it that it came? When did it sort of dawn on you that psychology was such an important part of working in financial markets?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I actually sort of have a slight aversion to calling it trading psychology. I think we all realise at some point that it's what's going on up there that really is a differentiator here for us when we're doing this job. But trading psychology often it's more of an academic term, and I like to think of trading performance. I like to think of which is more than just psychology. It's got many different aspects. It's about how you turn up when you do the job, what you're doing in the job, you know, your ability to run risk, your ability to be correctly aligned with the job. And, you know, so I think often, you know, you realize when you start doing this that, you know, as you would in, say, sport, that it's how you bring your whole self together to this job. You can't really separate it out. You know, how you analyze the markets, how you take that analysis into, you know, certain strategies and structures in your trading, how you take risk, how you manage risk, how you execute, how you hold yourself through that is one cohesive whole. I think what happens, we all traders go through this, is we think there's a kind of a solution to this job. There's a way of doing it that, you know, we just need to find that source code and, you know, A plus B equals C, and C means we're gonna make a lot of money or be very successful, or produce great returns. You know, and there's a formula, but there's not really a formula. You know, there might be a formula to a system or approach you're using, but it's so much more than that. It's your ability to be able to execute that and to stay on it and stay with it, and suffer from the bruising and battles that go with the job. So to me, I just want to sort of make it clear that I like to talk about performance more than psychology.
Okay, so what you're saying is it's very personal, and everyone goes through a different journey. I could teach you my technical analysis and my strategy, but that doesn't mean that you're just going to then become this consistently profitable trader within months. There's way more to it than just learning how to.
There's way more to it. There's way more to it at so many levels. Yeah, there's even more to it in what you're talking about. You could teach what you consciously know about what you do to other people, but even in your own approach, even your own trading, there's going to be a lot about yourself you don't know that's hidden within there. Kind of what I call level 2.
That's true.
So, you know, so you could tell them some of it. You couldn't tell them all of it because it's probably not even visible and known to yourself. And I hear this with a lot of people who said, you know, I spent stuff learning. I learned a simple system or method from someone, you know, who I know was making a lot of money with it. And yet when I tried to apply the system or method myself, I wasn't able to make money with it. and they said it was so simple, and it's because that person's to me, that person's system wasn't built for them, so it wasn't quite right for them. They would have needed to adapt it to who they were. But secondly, I said I would bet you bottom dollar that this guy couldn't tell you everything because so much of it was intuitive and tacit, and he made decisions that you couldn't quite fathom out, even though he was following what seemed like a simple system.
Okay, that's interesting. Not something I'd heard or even thought about. Yeah, I know that you need to adapt strategies to your own lifestyle and your own financial position and whatever else. But that's interesting that we make decisions and we react subconsciously. We're not even aware half the time of what we're doing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, our subconscious is so powerful. It does most of our trading for us.
Wow.
There will be
Okay.
times, I'm pretty sure, when you've looked at something that you did that was brilliant, okay, and you probably took full claim for it because it was you. But when you sit down and you sort of take it apart, you say, what was it made me do that at that moment? Because maybe I don't know. I believed in what I did. I was attuned to it. And other times I don't do it like that. Maybe I decided to put more on, and I don't know why, but something just felt right. And then you have the opposite of that, which we're probably more familiar with, because you probably, the times where it doesn't work, where you get the opposite of that, was like, why did I do that? What was going on? Well, it wasn't you; it was your subconscious most of the time doing that.
And you just mentioned level two. Is this how your performance coaching works? You have you work on different levels and you move through those levels?
Well, to be honest, level one and level two, I've never used those terms before. I just used it in the sense of the conversation to sort of
Oh,
bring it up. But um, yeah, there are kind of different levels of depth that we go to within ourselves as we do it. Most people, for example, if I was to use that term, level one and level two, most people when they talk about stuff in their trading that's not working, and they'll often say, "Oh, I lacked discipline. I was impatient. I was fearful, and I've just got to get rid of those behaviours." And I often say, well, those behaviours aren't the problem. Those behaviours are just symptoms. That's kind of what I would call level one. Okay, that's what appears on the surface. That's what you notice. Okay, but there's something much deeper. Okay, that's almost like the tip of the iceberg. That's the bit you see above the level of the sea. But 90% of what was causing those behaviors is deep and hidden and below the surface. And you probably do get a level two that you can see from the surface, where you can look down and you can see a little bit of what's down there. Okay. And if I was to use the level example further, let's look like levels 3, 4, and 5, where you go right deep into the structure of the iceberg and well below the surface of the ocean. And when I work with people, when I'm working with them, when I'm coaching them, um, in a way, the coaching is helping them reveal themselves, helping them understand themselves, helping them make more self-aware, helping them see what's pulling the trigger on their trading and their behaviors, helping them to understand it more. Okay, and it's not just about themselves; it's about their relationship with markets, with risk, with uncertainty. With the external worlds. It's not purely about them.
right. So you're not just coming up with solutions to those problems that they come with. You're then saying, okay, well, that's just how it's manifesting itself on the surface. We need to go right deep down and find out what's going on in your head.
Yeah, we have a saying: awareness is curative. Okay, so the more aware you can become of yourself, the more self-aware in the moment. Okay, the more you understand what is going on down there, the more you can start to change things, the more you can start to adapt, the more you can start to evolve. I went through a similar process when I was a trader. I worked with a performance coach about halfway through my career, and I just went on to become a different trader there. Now you know, he'd done some work with traders. He'd worked in markets, but he wasn't a trader himself. But he was a highly trained performance coach, executive coach. And what he really did was and I always say this to him, I say, you revealed me to myself for the first time ever. I saw in depth internally who I was. I always thought the answers were out there. More analysis, more news, more research, better systems. I just needed to find what was out there that I could bring into what I did. Yeah, I went in here, I went in there, in here, and I started to understand things about myself. I started to understand things about how I worked with markets, how I worked with risk, how I turned up. Okay, I started to find out about me, and when you find that about you, and you listen and you reflect, and if you're open-minded to it. If you're not open-minded to it, it won't work. If you're open to it, you're like, okay, I need to make some changes. You know.
Sounds like an exciting and scary process at the same time. And how long did that process take?
Yeah, it's never stopped. I mean, it's never stopped. My trading went through a big change after that, a massive change, and it started to happen quite quickly, but it just kind of just kept improving and kept rolling along, well beyond the end of the coaching, but triggered by what happened in that coaching and my almost like a new approach, where I looked at me and I looked at that, and I was working on them all together.
And that sounds like your light bulb moment. I mean, a relatively long light bulb moment. It wasn't happening over just weeks, but it was where the light went on.
It's
You went,
like all these
oh,
things.
this is how I
Yeah,
approach trading.
yeah. There was a kind of key light bulb moment, which we he again, the coach did a psychometric on me. He showed me what the results were, and one of the things he said to me, and maybe it was, it wasn't said in a way that it could have been taken the wrong way. So he said to me, I'm surprised you're a trader. I said, why is that? He said, well, I've looked at your psychometric, and it says you're far too analytical. Okay, you're highly analytical, and in his
Which means
mind,
you're not pulling the trigger enough.
yeah, they said that was someone who was probably too risk averse, too
Mm.
too sort of caught up in self doubt and worry, and wanted to go deep into the analysis, which I did always, and I was highly analytical in my work, and like I say, I always thought the answer there was in the analysis. That's all I needed to find the magic clue there. And I could have taken, there could be about, I don't like this, I don't like hearing this, I don't like hearing that I'm not made for the job, which is kind of what the implication was. But I took it as, he's right. This job isn't about analysis; it's about taking risk. It's risk taking. If I want to be an analyst, go and be an analyst. But if I'm in the job of taking risk, take risk. Use your analysis to serve that purpose, but don't let it lead it, which it was. And I kind of that was the moment where I kind of went through this. Like, how do I become better at taking risk? How do I, become?
And managing risk?
I've been doing it many years. I've been successful. 13 years in trading, but I had hit a bit of a buffer. I'd kind of, and I was caught in that cycle of self doubt and beating myself up and losing confidence. When things are great, they're great in this job. But when they're not, they're not. You get really down on yourself.
It's easy to get into a very negative spiral quite quickly.
Yeah. And I was in that space at that time. And I'd been in that space probably for 2 or 3 years. So I'm starting to think, okay, luck's running out. It's not working in this job. I got to start looking for a new career. I was already starting to take action, to sort of build in for that, thinking, I'll hold on for a little bit longer if I can. But I was at that point, I was relying on hope. The only chance I had was to hope that somehow I got a big trade, maybe a great new job somewhere, something fortunate would turn up. And it's not a great place to be, because deep inside your head, that, and I didn't know what I could do. And, the coaching itself was more luck than judgment. I was put into a trial program that we were running at the bank I worked at. And that changed everything for me. And I suddenly came out, and I probably did one of the biggest trades that I'd ever put on within a couple of months. And it made as
Wow.
we like to say, a truckload of money. And then, it just went forward from there, and it got better and better and better. And I really started working on, my trading philosophy, my trading approach, how I took risk, how I engaged with markets, um, and it was a journey that, and it was fantastic because I kind of fell in love with trading again. I'd fallen out of love with it by then.
I think we all do at some stage. That's quite interesting because everyone gets in this negative spiral, and you're trading on hope, and you're desperate, really wishing for something to turn around. And I've never really heard it like that, where you can literally just reverse the whole process and get yourself into this very positive spiral where you're continuing to make progress and really understand yourself.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was a positive spiral, and it was, a self-affirming one as well. So it kind of works in so many ways. Spirals, they're normally the opposite. They destroy all your confidence. They destroy your sense of self, and you just disappear into this hole. This was the opposite. This was sort of almost like coming out as a
Yeah.
trader.
Wow. And do you mind me asking, where were you at that time, and what were you doing? Were you still market making?
In a way, although I was in the sales side, I was at the German bank, Commerzbank at the time. Okay, so before that, my most successful period had been at Credit Suisse in London, where I was on the prop desk. And I'd never really been a market maker for long. So although I worked in the sales side, we call the sales side of the business, the market making side, I never really was active as a market maker. So in my early years, I was doing what we would call basis, arbitrage, that sort of stuff. Then I moved on to having a book, but the book didn't have any sort of flow running through it. So the only way I could make money was to be proprietary about how I took risk. Okay, there was no, the transaction.
That was a deeply psychological or
Yeah. So, and I preferred that. I always preferred that. I like to take the risk I had rather than had it thrust upon me. So I was always working like that, and I'd moved on, and I'd always wanted to engage like that. So I'd always consider myself more proprietary. I found it easier. Some people find market making easier. I found proprietary trading easier.
And how and when did that period of your life come to an end? Did you then move on to retail trading, or did you leave the trading game?
No, I moved on to American Express after in the early 2000s. So my confidence was restored. I felt really good about myself. I was trading well. And when you're doing well, you start getting phone calls. People start calling you up. Okay. They start hearing about, somehow the world works like that. So I started getting calls from other banks to come and work there. And American Express was a small bank. It wasn't one of the large sales side firms. An old friend worked there, and he said, "Look, come around here. You can prop trade. We'll have a good time. We'll give you capital to trade. It's not huge capital, but they reward you really well. There's a nice, great bonus scheme. And I thought, fantastic. I like the sound of that. No pressure, almost come and go. It was almost like a mini hedge fund environment, bizarrely, for me to work in. And I had a great time there. I was there for 7 years. And then American Express sold the banking arm of its business to Standard Chartered. And they didn't really need prop traders. They didn't want prop traders. This was just after the financial crisis. So my plan at that point was to go into the hedge fund world. But trying to find a job in the hedge fund just after the financial crisis was really difficult. So I started working for myself a bit for home, only for about a year. It's a very different game trading for yourself with your own money, trying to be a retail trader, as opposed to
Yeah,
working
that was
in
going to
a
be my next question. Actually, I wondered, how
yeah
did you transition?
in a banking
That's an
environment. So
interesting question. If you don't mind going
I
into
did
it.
it. I did it. I brought my Bloomberg at home, but I hated it. It wasn't something I was used to. I'd always had people around me, always worked with other people. Um, I didn't like being a lone trader working from home, and that affected me because you need that buzz. In a way, I partly probably traded off the buzz of the environment. So you know, I went back to my performance coach, who I knew he worked with a lot of hedge funds, and I said, look, I've been trying to get into a hedge fund. A couple of things nearly worked out, but never quite happened. It's a difficult time at the moment to get in. Could you help me? And he said, yeah, come in for a talk. We'll have a chat, and I'll connect you to a few people. Um, but during that conversation, he sort of planted the seed in my head of becoming a performance coach. And I love that idea. It just sort of hit me straight away, working with traders. So in my mind, I thought, you know what, I can carry on trading from home and do the performance coaching, develop myself as a performance coach, which I did for a while. I started studying coaching and went on courses and did a diploma. And then I started working with clients. But I found it very difficult to carry on trading, actually. I mean, I've never properly stopped trading. I always have a few small positions, but just in a small account. It's not a proper account anymore. Um, and maybe I'll do, um, in a quiet year, a dozen trades a year. In a busier year, maybe, two or three a month. Nothing serious. But I decided to go down the route really of developing my performance coaching business, and that was where, that was where my heart went. So I allowed my head to follow my heart.
Okay, so the trading now is more of a hobby really than a part of your career, and so now you're heavily involved with what kind of traders are you coaching these days? Are they more corporate hedge fund banking clients or retail or a mix?
Oh, right across the spectrum. Okay, most of my clients are
Okay,
corporate, so hedge funds, energy firms, commodity firms. I'm working with a couple of large hedge funds where I'm working with groups of traders there and teams. But also, we've got small prop traders, small hedge funds and family offices. Every single market, because I'm sort of person focused, it's not specific to a market. I even have a few clients outside of trading who are executive coaching clients who are in leadership roles in business. So it's not, about 85, 90% of my work is traders. But that's the lion's share. And like I
and
said, I do some
is
work
the
with retail.
process of
I try and keep a little bit of room
right
for some
and
retail traders in there as well.
okay, and is the process of coaching each person different? Is it very personal, or do you find that you coach corporate, or hedge fund bank traders differently to retail traders? Is it a different mindset? How does it work?
Well, it's very personal. I work on the person, and I'm working on their own
Mm,
challenges.
mm,
I'm working on who they are and how they engage with the role. So to that extent, it's the same for everyone. But the challenges are very different. The challenges of a retail trader, a person working for themselves with their own money from home, where the game is a lot harder for them. When I'm working in an organisation, you're working with people who are, working in teams. They have stakeholders, investors, or they might have, managers. They have a different functions. A lot of them are in market making roles. So they've got a franchise role to their work. So it's all about how can you make people more effective in their work? How can you help people become more productive? How can you help them move past the obstacles, personal obstacles that are getting in the way that often exist within them? Okay, that are often contrived by themselves or in some way linked to their past, their background, and that they're bringing in every single day into their work with them. Or maybe sometimes, other times we go more into basic stuff. There could be something in there in the structure of how they work wrong. There might be something in there the way they're managing risk. So we explore holistically everything they're doing, and then looking at, well, where to me are the points that are problematic. And sometimes we will be more on the surface than deep, because sometimes there is something going that is fundamentally flawed in their process. Other times it might be more within them. Usually it's a dance between both. Other times it can even be about how they're engaging with the outside world. They're just too concerned about how they look. So it comes back in. So in other words, it's hard to separate these things out. This is why we call it a holistic process, looking at the whole and understanding and maybe trying to explore where the different parts of it are. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring to them some sort of personal transformation in their behavior, behavioral change.
sure.
A little bit like happened to me all those years ago. It's that same philosophy. I explored lots of different aspects of how I was, who I was, how I worked. And I was then able to sort of, have these aha moments, and then it just kind of triggered more and more and more thinking, because I wasn't engaging with the risk properly. I wasn't engaging with the job properly. I was too much lost in myself, too much worrying about my concerns, and not focusing on what I should be doing, which was how I ran, how I managed risk, how I engaged with the market.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting. It sounds like you get to know your clients very deeply, and they've got to really open up to you. And this is a long process.
Yeah, yeah. It's some people, they do a one-off coaching program where you kind of you help them start with becoming more self-aware. Other people have kept me on for years, 5, 6 years, 7 years in some cases, or they come back a little bit later, a year or two later, that they want more. So, everyone does it in a different way. Some people want a kind of a one-off program. For other people, you become sort of like somebody who's with them on their journey.
Okay. I think I was saying that it gets you must get so personal. So people really have to open up to you, and it's it's obviously a lengthy process to really delve deep into their minds to get to the root of the issues.
Yes, yes. I just answered the question about how some people do a one-off program, some stay with it, and it becomes part of their
Mm.
journey.
Mm. Okay. And what was then well, I assume through all the experience, that's what triggered you to write the book, was it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was approached a number of years later by a publisher from a firm that produces books on the financial markets and trading. They'd had great success with Steve Ward's book, High Performance Trader. So they felt they wanted to try and reach out to another coach. They found me. And I we had an interesting chat. I wasn't sure. I said at the time, I said, "There's always been a book in my head, but I'm not sure what it is and how it's going to look." And I'll come back to them when I've had time to think about it. And I went back about 4 years later. It was during COVID,
Oh wow.
um, when obviously I had a lot of time on my hands. And I said, "Look, I think I've got an idea." I've been using a model and framework which I'd evolved from some study I've done in psychotherapy, which I was using with my traders, and it was resonating with them deeply. And I realised this was a way to look at how people engage with themselves and markets at the same time, as a framework for trading and for managing yourself. You might want to use the term managing your psychology, um, managing your performance and being more effective. And I felt that would be the a useful tool to bring out in the book and to use as a structure for the book. And they loved the idea, and I think it was in 2022 they gave me the go ahead for the book, and I wrote it in 23, and it was published at the beginning of last year.
Wow. Exciting. Okay. So I think I should read it, even though I've been in the markets for 40 years. I think that it would, clearly it would help anyone, or no matter where they are on their trading journey.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, well, it does, and I've had people say to me, it's helped me in entrepreneurship and sales as well. So it's although I talk about trading as a concept, it's applicable, to
Sure.
all fields of performance.
It's a performance coach book that's tilted towards the trader, but
Yeah, I use
anyone in
stories.
business
I use
or
stories from my past as a trader. I talk about
Mm.
a large trade that I did in 2007 that becomes kind of the central structure of the book, against the model and the framework. And I bring in stories from the clients that I've worked with as well, although I kind of amalgamate them into a few stories so that they're not identifiable by the client, in except a couple of cases where the client was happy for me to tell their story, although not with their actual name and company mentioned.
Okay, great. So you are referring to individual cases throughout the book without naming
Yes.
them.
Mm.
Okay, that's
In,
interesting. Can
in
you
a
give me
way,
one or two
it's like a
examples?
framework of stories. Yeah, yeah. So it's there was a guy who for the first hedge fund client I worked with back in the early days of my coaching, um, I worked with him for about a year. We did a lot of good work together, and I was sort of telling, he was someone who was clearly capable, but wasn't particularly performing to a high level. And he came in. He actually came into the coaching. He'd been 3 years in the hedge fund world. Before that, he'd spent about 12 years as a very successful trader for an investment bank in the fixed income world, in the sell side. And he expected to perform to a high level in the hedge fund, but his performance in those first 3 years was very underwhelming. And he used those terms himself. He said, "Look, I've been there 3 years, and basically I suck." That was more or less his opening line. I've
Sure.
managed to hang on because I haven't really had any big drawdowns, but I've really underwhelmed in my performance, and I know that if I don't turn it around this year, I'm probably out. And this was a great opportunity. It was a major hedge fund, and he really felt he needed to start putting some numbers on the board. And this is actually where I came up with one of the original concepts in the book called behavioral slippage, where he said to me, "Look, I have really good ideas, so I don't understand why I'm not able to turn that into money, into return, into alpha." And he showed me his journal. So he kept a very active trading journal, and in it he put every single idea he had. He wrote down, and he wrote down how much he'd put on, the catalyst for putting on or increasing the position, catalysts for getting out, where he would leave stops, where he would add, how he thought the scenario would play out. And he did that for every single trade. And I said, you've got this fantastic record. Why don't you go back over the 3 years you've been there and see how that would have
Mm.
performed had you follow your own analysis? Had you done what you said you were going to do? Okay, I'm
Mm.
assuming that you didn't stick to most of those ideas or plans.
Mm.
And he said that's a great idea. I'd never thought of doing that. So it could kind of
Mm.
create a backward looking, it was like a back test of all his ideas,
Mm.
that he'd really put in real time. Um, and he came back after a month. He said he took a month off. He put it all into an Excel spreadsheet, and he brought in the results after about a month, and we went through them. And he said, "Look, this is mad." He said, "My average return over 3 years, had I done everything I said and stuck to the plans, would have been close to 45% return, which would have made him the greatest hedge fund
So that was
performer in the
his light
world over."
bulb moment.
Yeah, he said my actual performance has been close to about 3% return. And I said, well, that whole gap between 3% and 45%, that only exists because of what's going on in there. It shows you can do it. That's behavioral slippage. It's purely behavior. Okay. Now,
Okay.
one thing I said is, look, that's probably unrealistic that you could put all those sort of risks on in that size, because you know what it's like. There would have been lots of cross correlations, and you know he'd have had too much risk on at times, or we know we can never really perform to that ultimate perfection level. That's
It's a theory,
impossible.
but
But
you could get
yeah,
close to it.
yeah, I said theoretically, you know, there is huge room. Even if you can get to double figures, you'll be a hedge fund champion if you could average that. you
Mm.
know and that's what we then worked on reducing that behavioral slippage. And he went on, and the following year he was the top performer in the fund, having been in the
Wow.
bottom 10 percentile the previous year. And a decade later he's still there, and he's still putting
Wow.
on great numbers on the board. So
That must
it
be
made a huge.
tremendously satisfying for you.
Yeah, and you know what was interesting, that after we worked together for about a year, Um, I didn't hear from him for a number of years. We stopped working together. He thought, this is helpful. I'm going to go out and give it a try. And then 6 years later, he called me up out of the blue, and he said, "Look, I see. I hadn't followed. You don't know how they get on
Mm.
afterwards." He said, "Look, I
Mm.
just wanted to phone up and say thank you very much." I said, "What's for?" He said, "You know," he said, "my average performance has been, you know, multiples of what I was achieving before, and I've achieved extraordinary success over those 6 years. My wife also wants to thank you because she thinks I'm actually calmer than I was.
Wow, really? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So it was great to hear that. It was great to have somebody actually lift up the phone and say thank you, and to tell you about the results that they've seen from this.
Is
Um,
that not
and
something
that,
that you get often? Then you don't stay in touch with your
well,
clients. That
I do, because a lot of them keep the coaching going, or they
sure.
renew. They go into a second year or third year. We go to a kind of slower, um, a sort of slower, more deliberate pace after that. But it's greatly rewarding, and do you know what? Whenever I see it, because traders, are very honest people. Um, they're not the big sort of outside the investment bank world, and they're not the big, they're not the images that people portray them often in the media. A lot of them
No.
are very humble. They're there to try and
Mm,
build a
mm,
nest egg for their family and to provide for them.
mm,
And they're ambitious. They want to achieve, you know, security, financial freedom, whatever it is. And it's such a hard job to do. So
mm,
few people actually succeed at it in
mm.
terms of percentage terms. And often
And it
those
never gets
battles are.
actually easy.
No, it's not. It's
Mm,
incredibly difficult. I work with some phenomenal traders and investors, both retail and corporate, and it never ever gets any easier. It's a constant
no.
fight, a constant battle.
The one thing, I mean, most jobs that you do, they get easier. You figure out a system, and as you go on, the experience pays off. But I must say, even after 38 years of trading, I just don't find it easy. I'm going to have to read your book. Um, so, what would you say? If I would say to you, can you think of one or two of the most rewarding experiences that you've had of coaching people? Does one spring to mind?
Um, I'm not sure one springs to mind, but several come together. It's that thing where you see people who say, there was a guy I worked with a number of years ago, maybe about a decade ago, who was in his 60s, and he was transforming from, a career job to, I'm going to give this a couple of years and I've got a retirement fund. I don't want to blow it all on trading. I'm going to give it some time to see how it works. And, you know, if after 2 years I'm not, he's been doing it by then for about 3 or 4 years. If after another couple of years it's not really working for me, I'm just going to pull away and do something else. And a decade later, he's still doing it. And I get a lot of those.
Wow.
And there was another one, where again in the sales side, um, I, there's a guy who was working for a bank, really nice guy, just an ordinary sort of, call him an ordinary Joe. He'd come through the back office, the middle office. He'd managed to land himself a spot on the foreign exchange trading desk. Came from a relatively, came from, sort of a very modest background. Came from a poor part of London, went to a school where, most people who, left that school who didn't end up inside in prison, became truck drivers or van drivers. So the fact that he'd already made it into a bank and a back office and middle office role was like a massive step up. And then he managed to get a job on the trading desk, one of the trading desks, as just one of the team. And he was doing okay. And his head of trading, and this was about 12 years ago, said to me, look, got this guy, Steve, you really like him. Could you work with him? He has some really good ideas, but doesn't seem to make a lot of money, and, comes in pretty close to budget most years, which is what you should make with the flow that comes in through the book. But, we always want them to take extra risk, put extra money on the board, that sort of thing. Could you work with him and see how you get on? And at the end of that time working together, turned around to me, he said, look, the manager said, I don't know what you've done. This guy's flying.
Wow.
He's absolutely hitting the ball out of the park. And
Wow.
I sort of, I went out for it. And really the conversation had gone. The guy had all the ability. He understood markets. He was very intuitive, picked up recognised stuff, knew where it was going to go, but he'd say to his colleagues, I think dollar mix is a good buy here. His colleagues would buy the trade, he'd put a tiny bit on, then he'd take the profit off and put it in the bin. Dollar mix would do the big move, and his colleagues would make a lot of money. So he was, and I was exploring what was going on because there was an internal conversation going on, which was really a lot. I'm not one of
Maybe
these
he didn't
guys.
feel that he
I think,
deserved the
yeah, he
money.
did quite himself. He didn't deserve to. Yeah, there was a little bit of that. There was a bit of this.
Yeah,
Steve, I'm
that's
very
an
modest
issue, isn't it?
background. I'm working here
Yeah,
with guys who went to Harvard and Oxford. I'm not as good as them.
yeah,
That sort of
yeah,
internal dialogue going on through his head. And I sort
yeah.
of
I
said,
can
look,
understand that.
you've worked harder to get here. They had it all set on a plate for them. You deserve it more. That sort of trying to change the narrative inside his head. And, it's just great
Very
to see the difference. And, more than a decade later, he's now global head of foreign exchange trading at this bank.
wow, isn't that incredible?
So,
What an
so you
achievement for
see
you.
that. And I always remember having a chat with him about a year later. And, what really sort of revealed itself was, he said to me, look, for the first time in my life, I've bought a big family holiday a year ahead, for the wife and the kids. He said, I always waited to the last minute to book a holiday just in case I lost my job. So in his mind,
Wow,
he always had this catastrophizing mindset going on that, this was as
that's so
good as it gets
interesting.
and it's going to come to an end. When you do that, that is playing out. That's holding you back. It's like chains, just holding you
I can
back.
relate to that.
Yeah.
I can relate to
So,
that. I've worked hard and tried to be successful out of fear of failure.
yeah.
So I can really relate to
And
that.
that's a
That's
big
my
part of my
driver.
coaching. Yeah, in
Is
a
it?
way, that's the
Mm,
key theme of my coaching and the key theme of
mm,
what I talk about in the book, that ultimately
mm,
we have to let go. We have to let go of all those things that are holding us back. A lot of it
mm.
is in there, because
Wow.
it is pulling the chains. And if we stop doing that's what's making us, full of fear. It's what making us doubt ourselves. It's what making us grab profits because we're so fearful that it's going to lose when it's on side, where it holds us back from putting
Yeah.
aside
Yeah. Yeah.
because we just think it's going to go wrong. We've got this negative tilt, this negative bias within us. So if
I can
you
really
can let
relate
go
to
of
that. And I know a lot of people watching can relate to that too, because I
yeah,
speak to so many people. They come to me with
yeah,
all their problems.
yeah, and
Um,
it's not
so,
going to go right because we're wired that way. It's
mm,
about becoming aware of it and understanding and
mm,
creating. Um,
okay.
I would say creating, you know, mindsets and attitudes that can overcome that. For me, one of the things that I had in my later trading years was this mantra where I told myself I've got to love my losses. So I called it learning to
Yeah.
love your losses. Love your
You hear
losses,
that all
Steve,
the time,
because
you see, but people don't really understand what that means. Is that something that you
yeah,
deal
well,
with in the book?
yeah, I talk about that mantra in the book. Love your losses
Right.
means if
Mm,
you're not going to lose money, you're not going to make money. It's that simple.
mhm,
It's a game of risk.
mm,
Okay, if you are not willing to sit there and draw down and have money disappear and have your account go like that, turn back down, because it's going to do that on the journey to that. If you're successful, it's going from
mm,
bottom left to top right, upward. If you actually
mm.
look at it, okay, it's gonna. If you look at it's like that. It's up and down. Everyone has
Sure.
drawdowns. If you were,
Mm.
I mean, sport is a great example. Just look at Rory McIlroy in the golf. It was the Masters last night. So if you think it's going to be like that, all you're doing is you're taking away the upside.
Right. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to start wrapping it up with how else can you just summarize for retail traders? What else can they get from the book?
Um, do you know what? It's to me. When I started this job trading all those years ago, um, back in the '80s, late '80s, early '90s, I was looking for clues to how to do this. I was looking for books. I said there must be books written on how to do this, and you can find lots of books that are about markets, books about how to value a company, a share price, an option. There were a multitude of books about that. That would count as trading books. There were some biographical books. Market Wizards still stands out as the great book of all time to me, especially the first one. Okay. Um, but there wasn't really a how-to book on trading. And that's what I was missing. And I was just like, yeah, how do I do this crazy job? It's insane. There must be something somewhere, a kind of guidebook. So in a way, this was my attempt to fill that gap. And that's what they can get. They can get a much deeper understanding of themselves as the person doing the job, the trader. There's lots of books about trading. Very few books about the trader. Mark Douglas, we know he wrote some great books. This is one of, there aren't many. Mark Douglas's
Yeah, that
books are
influenced
fantastic.
me
Yeah.
25 years
So
ago, I have to say. But I wish I'd
yeah.
met you 25 years ago. I'd have had a different career.
I say, this is the book I wish I'd had when I started out. And I love it that
Mm,
people message me all the time saying, I'm now reading it a third time. I'm making
mm,
notes as I'm going through it. I'm referring back to it. I get that all the time from people.
mm.
So it's great to hear that, and that's really what they can get from it. And retail trading is so much harder. It's you know guys like me in firms in businesses. You've got people around you all the time, guiding you, helping you. You can see them. You've been on the floor. The floor was a fantastic environment for learning. It was a brutal environment. It's school of hard knocks, but at the same time, you had people around you helping you, arm around the shoulders sometimes,
Yeah.
having your back. It was a fantastic environment where you could learn from. And some of the best traders, even now, indirectly have come from that environment because they learned from people who were down there. But other than that, if you're on your own doing this job and you don't have a mentor or mentors around you, so in a way, the book is meant to be that to other
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. That's something that I get. I know we've got to wrap it up quickly, but that's something I just don't understand. People come to me and they say, "Oh, I've lost X amount, and it's tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands, and I don't know what to do, and I really want to, keep going. I want to be a good trader. I want to make the money back." And I say, "Okay, well, I can help you." Blah blah blah. My course is X amount or whatever, and then I never hear from them again. And I know they've just gone off and they're still losing. They just don't understand that you've
No,
got to get help if you want to be successful at anything. You've got to get help.
I had this challenge at the very beginning when I was getting this going, where I was trying to sell a service as a coach to people, and no one was buying, and I understood why not, because I was really skeptical and cynical when I first was offered the chance to work with a coach. Because in a way it's a little bit of an affront to you. You think you can do it yourself. We all think we're all heroes in our own mind. You know, and we all think we can do this ourselves. Okay. And, I did have people make inquiries in the early days, and they would ask questions, and, they'd say, oh, and I'd give them a price. And in those days, I was a lot cheaper. And I go, how much? Sorry, I can't afford that. And I go, and I know they were paying that much to work with a
You
personal
can't
trainer.
afford not to do it.
Yeah, but they were paying that much for a year's worth of personal training at the gym. And
Right.
I'd have to get rid of my personal trainer, and I'm like, well, hold on a minute. Do you want to transform your trading career? Do you want to give yourself a chance? Sure, work with
Right.
a personal trainer. It was that sort of price,
Mm.
and but people can't see past that. It's like, but
No.
you don't go into high level professional sports, okay,
No.
without a coach. You don't. The higher you go up in the world of sport, the more coaches you have. You have multiple coaches, okay?
You don't even learn a
And
language without a coach. I mean, you don't even learn to drive without a coach. It's just
yeah,
so basic.
trading is a performance activity. It's not an
Mm.
academic activity. That's the
Mm.
whole point, okay?
Mm.
You can't learn to trade. Even now, even though I wrote a book, you can't learn to trade from a book, okay? It's like you can't learn to swim
No.
from a book, okay? It's a
No.
performance activity, okay? You have someone that shows you the way, someone that guides you, and
Mm.
if you're not willing to invest in that, if you think somehow you're a genius who's perfectly entitled
Ugh.
to be one of the small part of the 1% that actually managed to make it, okay, on your own because of your genius, you're going to fail. You're almost certainly making it the case that you're going to fail.
Well, even if you're successful, I think, you still are going to go through tough periods, and you're going to have,
Yeah.
I know your book will help people. It's certainly going to help me. I'm definitely going to read it. I'm serious.
Well, one of the things I love is when people come to me and they are extremely successful, and they say they just want to get better, and those are the clients that I really want to work with. I don't actually work with that many failing clients. I work with people who they usually come to me and they say, I'm doing well. I want to progress. I want to move up to the next level. Maybe there's a ceiling I'm struggling to break through, and I know I can get through that. Okay. Or just some people say, listen, I think it's time to work with a coach. I can see the benefits of it.
It was really interesting talking to you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. I was looking forward to this, and I really did enjoy it.
Absolute pleasure. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, my details are on there. info@alpharcube.com, or just go on the website and you'll see the links.
You do a podcast as well, actually, don't you? I didn't get a chance to ask you about that.
Yes, we have the Alpha Mind podcast. We're on episode, 140 something. We've been doing it for about 7 years. And there's some people have been on there.
Alpha Mind.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll have links to all of that for everyone in the description box.
Yeah. No. It's we love doing it. We love talking markets. So yeah, do check it out. 7 years worth of conversations about that.
Yeah, I'll be looking at that too for sure. Steve, thank you so much. That wraps up another very enlightening episode of The Trading Battle. Today we had the distinct privilege of hosting Steve Goldstein, a true rock star in the trading world. Steve's unparalleled insights into trading psychology and performance coaching have illuminated the path for many seeking mastery in the markets. His blend of self-awareness and strategic acumen offers invaluable lessons for traders at all levels. His book, Mastering the Mental Game of Trading, is highly recommended if you're aiming to sharpen your mental edge in trading. Thank you again for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to The Trading Battle on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. We're bringing you these behind-the-scenes looks at top traders every single week. Until next time, this is Jason Sen for The Trading Battle.